In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And a woman, 15 minutes dead on the floor, 9 of those minutes spent memorizing the way her left eyelid sits a fraction lower than her right. Most people wouldn't notice. Her colleagues would. The porter who carried her satchel every third day for 2 years would. People don't look at faces the way they think they do. They look at deviations. That's what kills you in this line of work. Not the blade, not the toxin, the eyelid. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from a Callidus Assassin of the Officio Assassinorum, 26 days into an assignment. The breathing, the stylus grip, the hymn she hums that 3 weeks of surveillance couldn't identify. Nobody will miss Merov Strahl. Nobody looks at her closely enough to see someone else looking back. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
The woman on the floor has been dead for 15 minutes, and I have spent 9 of those minutes memorizing the way her left eyelid sits a fraction lower than her right. Most people would not notice it. Her colleagues would. The cook who brings the evening meal tray would. The porter who has carried her satchel from the archive chamber to her quarters every third day for 2 years would notice. People do not look at faces the way they believe they do. They look at deviations. A jawline a touch too sharp. A gait half a step too long. A hand that reaches for a door handle at the wrong height because the woman reaching for it grew up in a house with different doors. These are the things that kill you in my line of work. Not the blade, not the toxin, not the weapons strapped flat against my spine. The thing that kills you is the eyelid. Her name is Merov Strahl, catalogist, 3rd Order, assigned to the private archive of Sector Governor Urchmund Holt on the civilized world of Carthenwald, 41 years old, born in the capital district, no living family, moderate build, light brown hair worn short in the administrative style, a scar on the inner left wrist from a childhood accident involving a document press. She eats her evening meal alone in her quarters. She walks with a slight forward lean, as if perpetually reading something held at waist height. She has a habit of pressing her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger when she is thinking, and she hums a melody I have not been able to identify from 3 weeks of surveillance, though I suspect it is a hymnal variant local to her district. She has no friends. She has 2 colleagues who tolerate her company at formal functions. She has a supervisor who forgets her name roughly 1 interaction in 3. She is, in the language of my temple, an ideal skin. Nobody will miss her, and nobody looks at her closely enough to see someone else looking back. I know all of this, because knowing it is my profession, and because she has been my assignment for 26 days. 26 days of watching through the surveillance servitor's relay feeds, through the auger net threaded into the archive wing's ventilation system by an operative I will never meet, who was on this world for 4 months before I arrived to do nothing except install those feeds and leave. 26 days of compiling a dossier that contains the way this woman breathes when she is bored, the way she holds her stylus, the sound she makes when she is surprised, which is a short intake through the nose followed by nothing, because Merov Strahl does not exclaim. She processes. She has processed everything that has ever happened to her in 41 years of quiet, invisible, administratively perfect life, and the last thing she processed was the needle I put through the base of her skull while she was reaching for her nightclothes. She did not make a sound. That was professional courtesy on my part. The toxin is a Callidus-specific compound. It stops the heart in 4 seconds, leaves no chemical trace after 6 hours, and produces an expression on the face that could be mistaken for a minor cardiac event if anyone were to examine the body. Nobody will. In 9 minutes, there will be no body. I am kneeling beside her in the dark of her quarters, which are exactly what you would expect for a woman of her station. Small, clean, functional. A cot, a wash basin, a writing desk, a shelf of cataloguing manuals arranged in the order she was taught at whatever minor administratum college produced her. There is a devotional Aquila above the desk, standard issue, and a single personal item on the shelf between the manuals, a pressed flower sealed in a thin glass frame. I do not know what kind of flower. It does not matter. What matters is that it is there, and that a woman who keeps a pressed flower on a shelf in a room nobody visits is a woman who has an interior life that I will now need to perform, and I have had worse assignments. I once spent 4 months being a dockmaster on a hive world who collected ceramic figurines of pastoral animals he had never seen, and every evening I had to sit in his quarters and paint them with tiny brushes while his wife told me about her day. The wife was the harder part. She knew him. I take the zip kit from my belt, a black plastic case the size of my palm holding everything needed to make a body disappear in a residential space. I unroll the bag, lift Merrivan's straw into it with the efficiency of having done this enough times that I no longer count, seal the valve port and turn it. The aerosol phosphorus activates with a faint hiss. In 8 minutes, the bag will contain chemical paste and dissolved fibre. I will flush it down the waste reclamation system in the shared ablutions block at the end of the corridor, where it will join the effluent of 900 other residents of the governor's administrative compound and stop being a person. Her nightclothes go in the bag with her. I repair the ones she was reaching for with the knit gun because the fabric tore when she fell, and a torn nightshirt on a dead woman's shelf would be a question nobody would ask, but someone might notice. While the bag works, I prepare myself. The polymorphine injector sits beneath the skin of my left forearm, a hard lump like a cyst, documented as exactly that in every medical screening I have ever been subjected to undercover. I roll up the sleeve of my sin skin, find the lump, twist it until the arming mechanism clicks, and press the activation stud that rises from my skin like a blister. People who have never taken it describe this poetically. It is not poetic. Polymorphine disassembles you, and not metaphorically. The drug interfaces with the surgical implants threaded through my skeletal structure, my musculature, my dermal layers, and my facial architecture, and it tells them to move. Bone restructures, cartilage softens and reforms, muscle mass redistributes. The skin becomes a fluid medium for 90 seconds, during which time it can be guided by will and by training into any configuration the operative has studied sufficiently. All of it is accomplished by your body tearing itself apart and rebuilding in real time, and the implants include nothing for the pain because pain is the control mechanism. You feel everything, every bone that cracks and resets, every muscle fibre that unknits and reweaves, every square centimetre of skin that loosens from the fascia beneath it and migrates to a new position on a body that is, for 90 seconds, not entirely a body. It is raw material being worked. I have done this somewhere north of 100 times. I do not know the exact number because the stripping process at the temple is not precise about preserving sequential memory, and some operations blur into others after a few decades. It does not get easier. The pain does not diminish with repetition. It is a fixed quantity, delivered in full every time, and the only thing that changes is that you learn to keep working through it. My hands are reshaping themselves into Merivyn Strahl's hands, which are narrower than mine, with shorter fingers, and a callus on the right middle finger from her stylus grip. And I am using those hands, while they are still half-formed, to check the contents of the bag, because the phosphorus cycle has a completion window of 40 seconds, during which the paste must be evacuated, or it begins to eat through the plastic, and nobody is going to wait for my skeleton to finish rearranging itself before the chemistry does what chemistry does. The face is always last. It is also always worst. Facial bone structure is dense and complex. The polymorphine has to work through the maxilla, the zygomatic arch, the mandible, the orbital bones, the nasal bridge, and each one restructures in sequence because the implants cannot process them simultaneously, without risking a cascade failure that would leave me looking like neither person and requiring surgical correction at a temple facility, which on this world would mean extraction, transport, and the failure of a mission that cost the Officio Assassinorum 19 months of preparation. So I lie on the floor of a dead woman's quarters, with the bag dissolving beside me, and I feel my face disassemble, and I wait. The left eyelid is the last thing I adjust. I have practiced it 400 times in front of a pict capture rig at the staging facility. It sits a fraction lower than the right, exactly the way hers did. When it is over, I stand up in a body that is not mine, and look at myself in the small mirror above the wash basin. Merivyn Strahl looks back at me. The resemblance is total, not cosmetic, not a mask worn over a different face. I am, at the level of bone and skin and muscle, this woman. My vocal cords have restructured to produce her voice. My height has decreased by 4 centimeters. My body mass has redistributed to match her frame. If you took a blood sample, the genetic markers would not match. But nobody on Carthenwald has Merivyn Strahl's genetic profile on file, because she is a third-order catalogist in a provincial archive, and the Imperium does not waste genomic indexing on people who do not matter. This is another reason she was selected. Everything about Merivyn Strahl was selected for, including the manner of her death, which I have timed to coincide with the 3-day administrative recess that begins tomorrow, during which the archive is closed and no colleague will expect to see her. I flush the paste. I clean the quarters. I take her position on the cot, wearing her nightclothes, lying in the way that her sleep posture suggests she slept, on her left side with one arm under the pillow, and I close my eyes. In 17 hours the recess will end, and I will walk into the archive wing of Sector Governor Urchmond Holt's compound as the woman who has worked there for 2 years, and nobody will look twice at me, because nobody ever looked twice at her. That is the job. Everything after it, the months of proximity, the accumulation of access, the execution, the extraction, those are consequences. The job is this room, this mirror, this dead woman's eyelid, and the 90 seconds of restructuring that make me her. I am going through it in order because that is the only method I have. There is no one in this cell and nothing to write on. And in 3 weeks a compound goes into my arm and takes whatever it takes. And the parts I have said through once are the parts that have sometimes still been there afterwards. I do not know why that works, and it is in no manual I was given. I have done it since my 4th or 5th return, and I have never mentioned it to an overseer, because a woman who has found a way to keep things is a woman with a fault in her conditioning, and faults get corrected. I have been a Callidus Assassin for what I estimate is 53 years, though that figure comes with a margin of error I would not accept in any operational context. The temple took me young enough that the implantation could be integrated with my growth cycle, which means they cut me open before I had finished becoming a person and put things inside me that ensured I never entirely became one. I do not remember the recruitment. The earliest memory I can verify as genuine is a training chamber in the temple facility on a world whose name I am not cleared to know, standing in a line with 11 other girls, watching a woman who was not a woman walk across the room in front of us. She was demonstrating polymorphine transition. She went from a tall, thin-faced female operative in a sin-skin body glove to a heavy-set male dock worker in the time it took the rest of us to understand what we were seeing. 3 of the girls in the line fainted. One of them screamed. I remember thinking, in whatever language I thought in at that age, that the screaming was a waste of energy, because the woman had not done it to us. She had done it to herself, and the point was not the horror of it, but the competence. I was wrong about that, as it turned out. The point was both. Her name was Operative Luren. She was our primary instructor for the first 6 years of temple conditioning, and she was the most patient woman I have ever met in any body, including the ones I have worn. She taught us polymorphine theory before we were old enough to receive the drug. She taught us observation, memorization, vocal mimicry, gait analysis, the taxonomy of human behavior as classified by the temple's analytical division into 940 categories of movement, expression, and social interaction. She taught us that every human being is a system of patterns, and that a system of patterns can be reproduced by anyone willing to study it with sufficient attention and endure sufficient pain. She also taught us that 60% of the girls in our intake would be dead before the end of the 10th year, and that this was not a threat, but a statistical observation based on historical data, and that the ones who survived would not necessarily be the strongest or the most talented, but the ones who had the particular quality the temple called adhesion, which is the ability to hold on to yourself while being someone else. Luren was killed during a training exercise when I was in my 9th year. The exercise involved live targets, which at that stage of our conditioning meant human subjects drawn from the penal population of whatever world the temple's supply contracts covered. We were learning close-quarters elimination, and Luren was demonstrating the insertion of a poison blade through the gap between the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae at a 40-degree angle, which is the Callidus standard for a silent kill in a confined space. The subject convulsed. This was not unexpected, but the convulsion drove Luren's hand into the path of her own blade as it exited, and the toxin on a Callidus needle does not distinguish between targets and operatives. She died in 9 seconds. Nobody replaced her. The temple reassigned her teaching duties across 4 other instructors, and her name was removed from the active roster, and I have carried her in my head for 40 years the way you carry a stone in your boot. Not because she was kind to me. She was not kind to anyone. She was precise, which is better. I will call the other one Sathel, which is close to what she was called. The real naming conventions sit at a classification that makes saying one out loud a disciplinary matter even in an empty room, and my file does not need the entry. She was the best of us at vocal mimicry, could take any voice inside 3 repetitions, and the instructors brought her recordings from worlds she had never seen just to watch how fast the accent arrived. She lasted to the 14th year, which is when they give you your first polymorphine. Her body rejected it. The implants tried to restructure her, and her biology fought back, and what was left was not recognizable as either the person she had been or the one she was becoming. She lived for 2 hours. I was in the next chamber. I heard most of it. I have been told since that the incompatibility is genetic, and that nothing in her conduct or mine could have altered it, and I accept that, and it has never once helped. 14 years of instruction, and the only thing I have never been able to make my body do on command is stop hearing that. Of the 12 girls who stood in that line watching Luren change her shape, 4 of us survived to operational deployment. I do not know what happened to the other 3, because operational Callidus do not maintain contact with each other. We do not have colleagues. We do not have friends. We do not have the kind of relationships that involve knowing where another person is, because knowing where another Callidus operative is deployed is a security breach that the Temple addresses with the same directness it applies to all security breaches, and I have seen what that directness looks like from the operational end, and it is thorough. What we have is the cycle: Temple, operation, Temple, preparation, deployment, extraction, reconditioning, preparation. It repeats, and has for 53 years, and will until the polymorphine stops working, or the Temple decides I have degraded past operational viability. Then I am retired, which is the Temple's word for what it does to an operative who can no longer hold a shape and a cover and a kill order in one skull. I have not seen a retirement. I am told they are quick. I am also told the implants are recovered for reuse, which makes it surgical, and surgery on a live subject leaves more intact material than surgery on a dead one. I do not follow that thought further. Tonight, the task is sleeping in a dead woman's bed and waking up as her. The morning comes the way mornings do on Carthenwald. Grey and administrative. The world carries a civilized classification, which in the Imperium's taxonomy means a functioning government, a stable tithe output, an educated population, and enough infrastructure to sustain itself without direct intervention from any of the major adepta. It also means it is boring. I do not say that as a criticism. Boring is the operational environment I prefer. I have worked hive worlds where the background noise of 50 million people living on top of each other made surveillance a statistical exercise rather than an observational one. I have worked feral worlds where the locals spoke in a dialect that took me 3 weeks to decode, and the target had to be approached on foot through terrain that would have killed an unaugmented human in 4 days. I have worked a forge world once, under circumstances I am not permitted to describe, wearing a body that was not entirely flesh, and the less said about that, the better. Carthenwald is none of those things. Carthenwald is a world where the greatest daily hazard is a scheduling conflict in the administrative calendar, and that suits me perfectly, because the fewer variables in the environment, the fewer things can go wrong with the cover. I dress in Merivyn Strahl's clothes, which I laid out the night before in the order her surveillance profile indicates she follows. The slate-grey tunic of a third-order catalogist, the belt with its authentication tags, the soft-soled shoes she wears inside the archive. I brush my hair short and practical the way she keeps it. I eat the ration bar out of her desk drawer. It is a standard administratum issue compressed nutrient block, and it tastes like a standard administratum issue compressed nutrient block. I eat it the way she eats it, standing at the desk reading something on a data slate while chewing mechanically, because Merivyn Strahl does not sit down for meals. She eats as a maintenance function. I find this admirable. I eat the same way when I am being myself, on the occasions when I remember what being myself consists of. The walk from her quarters to the archive wing takes 7 minutes at her pace, brisk and forward-leaning, and does not vary regardless of the weather or the density of foot traffic in the compound's internal corridors. I have rehearsed it at her exact stride length of 58 centimeters, and I make the walk with the data slate in my left hand, reading as I go, because that is what Merivyn does. And every person I pass on this walk has seen her do it 1,000 times and would notice its absence before its presence. This is the central principle of deep cover. You do not create a disguise. You maintain a pattern. The pattern was already here. You step into it the way you step into a current, and the current carries you, and the moment you stop matching it is the moment you drown. The archive wing is a long hall on the eastern side of the governor's compound, climate-controlled to preserve the physical documents stored there. Carthenwald is old enough and prosperous enough that the governor's household still maintains paper records alongside the standard cogitator banks, and the archive contains roughly 400 years of administrative correspondence, tithe assessments, population surveys, military requisitions, trade licenses, judicial findings, and the personal papers of 14 generations of the Holt family who have held the sector governorship as a hereditary appointment since the world's second founding. Merivyn Strahl's job is to catalogue, preserve, and retrieve these documents on request. It requires access to every room in the archive, familiarity with the household's filing conventions, and a level of institutional invisibility that makes her the most valuable person in this building. She goes everywhere. She touches everything. Nobody watches her. Watching a catalogist work is like watching paint oxidize, and that is the point. That is why the officio spent 19 months identifying her, surveilling her, verifying her isolation, confirming that her death would go unnoticed long enough for the substitution to take hold, and sending me across 3 subsectors to kneel on her floor and memorize her eyelid. The first day is the hardest, and not because of the performance. The performance is mechanical, and mechanics I can do. It is hard, because everything the officio gathered was gathered from outside her life, through auger feeds and intercepted traffic and analysis at a distance. Now I am inside it. I am sitting at her desk in the archive, and I discover that her chair has a wobble she compensates for by shifting her weight to the left, and that her stylus has a crack in the casing that she has repaired with a strip of adhesive tape, and that she keeps a second ration bar in the bottom drawer of the desk behind a stack of blank index cards, and that the drawer has a particular stiffness that requires a specific angle of pull to open smoothly. No surveillance captures any of that. These are the details that make a person real, and I have to find and absorb them in real time, without fumbling, while doing a job on a filing system I learned from documentation and have never physically operated. The supervisor comes by at the second hour. His name is Archivist Principal Wexlin, and he is a small, dry man who looks at me the way he looks at everything. The vague dissatisfaction of someone who has spent 30 years in a job that is exactly important enough to prevent him from leaving, and exactly unimportant enough to prevent him from advancing. He keeps a chronometer on his desk that runs 3 minutes fast, and in 30 years nobody has told him. He tells me there is a retrieval request from the governor's secretariat for the trade compact records from the Aubercoin subsector, volumes 6 through 13. I say yes, Archivist Principal, and begin pulling the volumes, and he watches me for 4 seconds and then leaves, because Merivyn Strahl does not make mistakes in the archive, and there is nothing interesting in watching someone do a job correctly. He did not look at my face. He looked at my hands. He looked at the way I handled the volumes, the flat-palmed grip Merivyn uses to avoid pressing the binding, and that was all the verification he needed. By the end of the first week, I have settled into her pattern so completely that there are moments when I am not performing at all. I am sitting at her desk, sorting index cards, and the sorting is happening without conscious direction. My hands know where the cards go. My body knows the posture. My breathing has matched the rhythm of the room, quiet, cool, smelling of old paper and the faint chemical tang of the preservation agents used on the older documents. I catch myself humming. The melody is the one Merivin hums, the one I could not identify from the surveillance feeds. I still cannot identify it, but my throat knows it. The compound holds devotions twice a week in a hall off the eastern colonnade that was a records annex until the Ministorum asked for it and the household found it cheaper to give than to argue. There is one confessor for 400 staff. His name is Ferrand, and he is old enough that the rotation is visibly costing him, and he also covers the vehicle yards, the kitchens, and the outer barracks on a rotation that puts him in this hall on alternate weeks, and on the other weeks a lay reader from the Secretariat does the office out of a printed card. Attendance is recorded, so Merivin attended, and therefore I attend. I stand in the third row and give the responses to the litany of diligent service, and I do not know the words. My mouth knows them. Somewhere in the surveillance material there was audio of Merivin at devotions, and the conditioning took it in whole, the way it takes gait and stylus grip. And now the responses come out of me at the correct pitch and the correct half beat behind the confessor, without passing through anything that could be called belief. Ferrand does not look at the third row. He has been giving the same benediction to different faces since the confessor before him died and was not replaced. And there are more faces than evenings. And a man in that position stops seeing rows and starts seeing the room. I assessed him in the first month the way I assess everyone. He is the only person in this compound who could put a hand on my shoulder without it being a security event, and he never has, and he never will, because he does not know I exist. The staff around me are giving the responses for their own reasons. The Emperor does not appear to mind. In my experience, he rarely does. The temple calls it submersion. Your true self recedes below the surface into what they call the subsurface, a second mind under the first, holding the kill instinct, the combat training, the extraction protocols, everything Merivin Strahl does not know and cannot do. At the moment of the kill, the subsurface rises, and the assumed identity peels away, and you are briefly and violently yourself again. The problem is that it is a gradient and not a switch. The longer the operation runs, the deeper you go. I have heard of women who went so deep the kill trigger failed, and the temple extracted somebody who did not know she was a weapon and believed she was whoever she had been for 3 years. I have heard the reconditioning for those cases does not always work. I have been Merivin Strahl for 5 weeks now. I wake in the morning, and for the first 3 or 4 seconds, I do not know that I am not her. Then the subsurface asserts itself without hurry, the way a filed thing surfaces when the right index is pulled, and I remember what I am and why I am here, and who is going to die at the end of this. Sector Governor Urchmond Holt is a man who looks exactly like what he is. The 14th consecutive member of his family to hold absolute administrative authority over a territory larger than most subsectors. He is tall, broad-shouldered, grey at the temples in a way that suggests either distinguished genetics or a very attentive personal chirurgeon, and he carries himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who has never in his life had to justify his presence in a room. I see him for the first time at a formal reception on the 38th day of my infiltration, the Feast of Ascension, a local holiday commemorating the founding of the Holt governorship, and the entire compound staff is required to attend. I stand at the back of the hall in the position appropriate to a third-order catalogist, and I watch him. He has 12 personal bodyguards out of the household cadre, retired officers of the Carthenwald Planetary Defense Force. They scan the room in the correct overlapping pattern and hold the correct distances and carry their sidearms in the correct draw position. Against a conventional threat, they would be adequate. Against me, they are decoration. I could kill him from where I am standing, with the poisoned needles in my tunic collar, or the neural shredder folded into a hair clip at the base of my skull, which Merivyn Strahl would have called decorative if anyone had asked, and nobody has. But the sanction specifies natural causes, and a man who collapses at his own feast with a needle wound in his neck does not die of natural causes. He dies of assassination, and the assassination of a sector governor brings the arbites and the administratum, and possibly the Inquisition. We are not here to be seen, we are here to be a heart attack. So I watch him, and I memorize his pattern the way I memorized Merivyn's, and I begin the second phase of the operation. Access. I need to be close enough to him, for long enough, in circumstances controlled enough to administer the agent without witnesses and without leaving evidence. In a compound with 12 bodyguards, 400 staff, a functioning security cogitator network, and a governor who receives visitors by appointment only in a chamber that is swept for toxins twice daily. This is not a simple problem, but it is my kind of problem. I am a catalogist. The governor has an archive. The archive contains documents the governor occasionally needs to consult. When the governor needs a document, a catalogist brings it. The real Merivyn Strahl was never permitted past the outer reception chamber. Documents went to a secretary who carried them in. She never had a reason to want that changed. She did not need to be in the room with him and nobody watching. I will need a reason. I will need to make it the governor's idea. And I will need 3 more months to arrange it, because the access I require cannot be rushed without creating exactly the anomaly that makes a competent security officer ask questions, and the governor's security chief, a woman named Essendra Vol, is competent enough to concern me. Essendra Vol has been the governor's security chief for 16 years. She is a former commissariat adjutant who transferred to private service after a career that the Offizio's background file describes as distinguished and unremarkable, good enough to be competent and not good enough to be noticed, and that combination is the one I like least. The ones who are noticed are predictable. They have reputations and habits and vulnerabilities that come with visibility. The ones who are not noticed are the ones who watch. Vol watches. She watches the compound the way I watch a target, with the patient, comprehensive attention of someone who understands that threats do not announce themselves. She runs random sweeps. She rotates guard schedules on a pattern I cannot predict, which means it is either genuinely random, and that is rare, or keyed to a variable I have not found. More common and more useful, because a variable I have not found is one I can look for. I spend my first 3 months as Merivyn Strahl doing nothing that Merivyn Strahl would not have done. I catalogue documents. I attend mandatory staff functions. I eat alone. I walk the 7-minute corridor at the same pace, reading the same data slate, wearing the same expression of mild distraction that is Merivyn's resting state. I do not seek access to the governor. I do not ask questions about his schedule. I do not adjust my routine in any way that would register as a deviation from the established pattern. It is the most tedious part of being a Callidus Assassin. Vol finds me in the sub-level corridor on the 63rd day. I am returning a climate-sealed crate to secondary storage, a task Merivyn did bi-weekly, and I have kept precisely. And Vol is at the junction where the sub-level meets the maintenance access, standing the way she stands everywhere. Still, watching, not explaining why. She works through the standard questions first. What I am carrying, where I am going, when I last accessed the sub-level. Routine. Then she asks whether I have noticed anything unusual in the archive's sub-level access logs, because the monitoring system flagged an irregular entry 5 days ago, and the entry corresponds to a time when the sub-level should have been unoccupied. I tell her I went down for a humidity-damaged document the archivist principal had flagged, that the terminal was mid-firmware and would not take my tag, so I used the manual register, and that I filed a maintenance request the next morning. All of it is true. I did all of it because I do everything Merivin would have done, and Merivin filed maintenance requests about malfunctioning terminals. Vol looks at me for 3 seconds longer than the conversation requires. Then she nods and walks away. She does not apologize for stopping me. She does not explain the context. She files the information the way I file index cards, efficiently and without commentary, and she will cross-reference it later, and it will check out, because I made sure it would. But for those 3 seconds, while her eyes were on me and her commissariat-trained instincts were running their assessment, the subsurface was calculating the distance between my hand and the poison needle in my collar. And the distance was 8 centimeters, and the time required was 1.2 seconds. If she had said one more sentence, the sentence that meant she was not satisfied, I would have killed her in the sub-level corridor and spent the next 4 hours dealing with a body and a compromised cover and a mission that had just become significantly more complicated. She did not say that sentence. She nodded. She walked away. I continued to the secondary storage with the climate-sealed crate. I did not adjust my breathing. Merivin Stral has nothing to be nervous about. Nobody tells you about the boredom. The temple trains you to endure polymorphine. Nobody mentions the ration bars. It does not train you for the 7 months of sitting at a desk being a woman who catalogues trade records from the Aubercoin subsector. It does not train you for the evenings in a small room with a wash basin and a pressed flower, and nothing to do except maintain the cover, doing what Merivin would have done. Reading cataloguing manuals and going to sleep early, because Merivin Strull did not have hobbies and she did not have interests, and she did not have a life outside the archive. And now neither do I. The porter catches it in the 4th month. He has carried Merivin's satchel from the archive chamber to her quarters every 3rd day for 2 years, and he falls in beside me in the east corridor and says I have been walking quicker lately. Not an accusation. The opposite. He is pleased. He thinks the work is agreeing with me. My stride is 58 centimeters and has been since the first morning. What he has noticed is cadence, and nobody built Merivin's tempo into my dossier. For 3 months, I held it consciously. By the 4th, the submersion was carrying the walk for me, and the submersion carries the pattern, not the pace. Underneath a dead woman's stride, something was setting its own speed, and it was not hers. I tell him the retrieval load has been heavy. He says that will be the new secretariat. They request everything twice, and he carries the satchel the rest of the way and talks about his knee. Then he goes back to the porter's room and does not mention it to anyone, because there is nothing to mention. A woman walked faster. For the following week, I walk slower, and after that I stop thinking about it, and that is the closest anyone on Carthenwald ever comes. There is a particular quality of silence in a room where nothing is happening, and nothing is going to happen, and the only purpose of your presence is to be there, so that the next morning, when you walk to the archive, you walk from here, because a woman who sleeps somewhere else is a woman who has something to explain. Previous operations come back during these evenings because the subsurface does not manage the boundary cleanly, and my actual life bleeds into the cover identity's empty hours. Venice Court, a hive world in the Oldenmoor subsector. 9 months as a domestic servant to an administratum prefect named Kolvan, who was embezzling reconstruction funds out of a war-damaged sector. 3 regiments were going short because of it, and somebody calculated that removing 1 prefect was cheaper than auditing a treasury. I killed him with a poison needle through the base of the skull while he slept, in the bed I had made for him every morning for 9 months, and arranged him so the household chirurgeon would find a man who died peacefully in the night. The puncture mark was the size of a paw. Nobody investigated. The operation was classified as a clean success, and the officio filed it in whatever archive the officio uses to store the records of people who died of perfectly natural causes that happened to coincide exactly with the strategic interests of the Imperium. What I remember about Veniscourt is not the kill, it is the cup. Colvan drank his recaf every evening from the same cup, a chipped ceramic thing with a faded regimental crest that I think was his father's, and every evening I brought it to him, and every evening he took it without looking at me, because I was a servant, and servants are furniture with hands. I drank from that cup once, the night after the kill, while I was cleaning his quarters for the last time. I do not know why. The recaf was cold and tasted like nothing. I washed the cup and put it back on the shelf where it belonged, and it is probably still there, and I think about it more than I think about the needle. Tremondon comes back at night, in the gap between Merrivan's sleep cycle and whatever it is I do when the submersion is thin enough to surface. A civilized world in the Nirandel Reach. A target the briefing called a heretic preceptor. Otrek. He ran a cult, or what the officio classified as one, though from the inside it was a civic improvement society with theological ambitions. He believed the Emperor's light reached the outer systems thinner than it left, and a few hundred people agreed with him by holding meetings in basements and distributing pamphlets, and occasionally refusing the ecclesiarchy tithe, which the Imperium tolerates right up to the point where it does not. My cover on Tremondon was a woman named Vrenna Orench, a recent widow who had come to Otrek's group seeking community. I attended meetings, I listened to speeches, I brought baked goods to gatherings, because Vrenna Orench brought baked goods to gatherings, and within 5 months I was in the inner circle. And on Tremondon, that meant I was one of 8 people who sat in Otrek's kitchen after the meetings and drank weak tea and discussed which passages of the Imperial Creed supported their position. These were not dangerous people. They were disappointed people. And the distinction does not matter to the sanction order. A sanction order specifies a name and a method. It has no field for the operative's assessment of whether the target deserves to die. I killed Otrek with a phase blade through the sternum while he was washing dishes after a meeting. The blade phased through his chest cavity and stopped his heart without leaving an entry wound. He fell into the sink. The water kept running. I left through the back door and was off-world within 48 hours. His followers were rounded up by the local Arbites 3 weeks later and processed through the standard heresy tribunals, which on a civilized world means labor penitence for the ones who recanted, and something worse for the ones who did not. I do not know the numbers. By the time the tribunals concluded, I was on a different world with a different face. The specificity of Otrek's dishes in the sink, the way the water ran over his hands as he fell, the sound of a baked goods plate sliding off the counter and breaking on the floor. These are details that should have been lost in the reconditioning and were not. The Temple's reconditioning is designed to reset the operative between deployments, to remove the assumed identity, to restore the operative's baseline personality, and to suppress operational memories that could compromise future deployments or the operative's psychological stability. It works. It does not work perfectly. Every reconditioning leaves things behind, and the things it leaves are not predictable. The name of the world where I completed my third operation is gone. The way the woman I replaced there folded her napkins is not, and my hands still do it when nothing is watching them. The face of the man I killed on my 7th operation is gone. The smell of the room he died in is not. Machine oil and boiled starch and something sweet I have never been able to identify. The reconditioning takes the architecture and leaves the furniture. It takes the plot and leaves the sensory detail. And over 53 years of operations, the sensory details accumulate. Which is why I am doing this in order and out loud, in a room with a locked door and 4 bare walls. The way you would walk a corridor, you expect to be dark on the way back. The architecture is the part that goes. So I say the architecture. I find the first anomaly in the governor's records on the 92nd day of my infiltration. I find it because finding things in records is what Merivyn Strahl does, and by the 92nd day, the submersion has progressed to the point where I am doing Merivyn's job with Merivyn's competence, considerable. She was not a remarkable woman. She was a remarkable catalogist. She understood filing systems the way an engineer understands machine spirits, with an intuitive grasp of structure that went beyond the mechanical. And that competence, loaded into my consciousness by 3 months of submersion, is what makes me notice that the trade compact records from the Aubercoin subsector, the same records I was asked to retrieve on my first day, have been accessed 47 times in the past 18 months by the governor's personal authorization code. 47 times, for records that cover interstellar commerce agreements dating back 3 centuries, records that should be of interest to precisely nobody except a historian or a trade archivist, and the governor is neither. I do not flag this. I do not investigate it. I note it in the subsurface and I continue cataloguing. The 92nd day is not the day for discoveries. It is the day for being Merivyn Strahl, who does not notice patterns in access logs. But the subsurface notices. The subsurface notices everything, and it files it the way I file index cards, and it waits. By the 4th month, I have established a routine that includes a weekly delivery of archived correspondence to the governor's outer study, the room where the secretariat handles his administrative schedule. I have engineered this by being exceptionally competent at my job, not difficult, because I am borrowing Merivyn's competence, and Merivyn was better at this than anyone currently employed in the archive wing. The archivist principal noticed. He did not compliment me because Wexlin does not compliment anyone, but he reassigned 2 of the more complex retrieval chains to my desk, which included the governor's personal correspondence archive. 3 weeks later, the Secretariat began requesting deliveries directly, bypassing the archivist principal's office, and from there it was a matter of 2 more weeks before the secretary who handles the governor's study mentioned in passing that it would be more efficient if the catalogist brought the documents through to the inner study rather than leaving them with the reception clerk, because the reception clerk had twice misfiled a return, and the governor was particular about his records. This is how access works. You do not ask for it. You make it inevitable. The first time I enter the inner study, the governor is not there, and the room is empty except for a security servitor in the ceiling corner. I place the documents on the designated shelf, look at nothing else, and leave. The second time, 4 days later, he is at his desk with a data slate. He glances up, looks at me the way he looks at all household staff, and goes back to his reading. I place the documents. I leave. The third time, he asks me a question. He wants to know whether the archive holds the original survey reports from the colonization of the Growlhaven Plateau, and I tell him that the originals are in climate-sealed storage in the sub-level archive and that I can have them delivered within the hour. He nods. I deliver them. He does not say thank you, because sector governors do not thank catalogists. He makes a note on his data slate. From that day forward, my name, Merrivan's name, is on the approved access list for the governor's inner study, and I can walk into the room where I am eventually going to kill him whenever the schedule permits, carrying whatever I want, watched by nobody except a security servitor whose visual feed is monitored by Essendra Vol's team from a control room 3 floors below. And that is going to be a problem. And it is a problem I am going to solve with patience and a filing cabinet. The Officio's most dangerous assassin, and the weapon I have spent 4 months sharpening, is a filing system. The filing cabinet itself is a tall, narrow, climate-sealed document safe that stands in the corner of the governor's inner study behind his desk, and it contains the records that are not in the general archive. Every governor has them. Personal correspondence, private financial records, sealed communications from the Subsector Naval Command, intelligence summaries from the Planetary Defense Force, and whatever else a man in his position accumulates over a lifetime of holding absolute authority and needing to remember where the bodies are, sometimes literally. The cabinet is locked with a gene-coded seal that responds only to the governor's biometrics, and it is positioned in the corner of the room directly below the security servitor's visual arc, which means that whatever the governor does with it, he does it on camera. This is standard compound security design. Essendra Vol would have insisted on it. What Vol cannot control is the placement of the furniture around the cabinet, because that is the governor's study, and the governor arranges it as he pleases. And the governor is a man of habit who has had his desk in the same position for 20 years. And the desk creates a blind spot, not for the cabinet itself, but for the 60-centimeter gap between the cabinet and the wall. The servitor's tracking cycle sweeps the door every 94 seconds, and during that 3-second window, the gap is invisible. The cycle is 94 seconds, because a lay technician of the cult Mechanicus recalibrated the unit 2 governors ago and set it to the interval the pattern's machine spirit was said to prefer, and nobody in this compound has the standing to change a number. A tech adept wrote down. Essendra Vol could requisition a new servitor. She cannot retune this one. I will need 1.6 of those seconds. Not to kill the governor. I will never touch the governor. What I need the blind spot for is the document. The killing agent is a cardiac destabilizer. A compound that mimics a natural cardiac event so precisely that the post-mortem will find exactly what it expects to find. It also has to survive the room, and the room is swept twice a day. The sweep is an air and surface protocol run by 2 of Vol's people with a hand spectrometer calibrated against a schedule of compounds the Administratum considers assassination agents. Every one of those is volatile, because it has to cross a room, or persistent, because it has to wait on a handle. The instrument looks for a thing present in quantity and intending to remain. What I am carrying is a trace on paper that degrades on contact with tissue into products the body makes anyway. And it is not on the schedule, because the schedule lists what has already been used and identified. The sweep will pass the room clean, and it will be correct. It absorbs through dermal contact in 4 seconds, begins degrading cardiac tissue within 6 hours, and metabolizes completely before death. No toxin to detect, no entry wound. The chirurgeon will write natural causes, but the compound must be applied to the document the governor will handle, and the application cannot happen under the servitor's eye, because a catalogist who touches a cover page with bare fingers instead of her cotton gloves is a catalogist doing something she should not. The blind spot is where I will stand, gloves off, for 1.6 seconds while the servitor tracks the door. That is the method. The Vindicare shoot people in the head. We give them paperwork. What I have not yet mentioned, because it was not relevant until now, is that I have been reading the governor's files, not the files in the sealed cabinet. I do not have access to those and will not attempt to acquire it, because gene-coded seals are beyond my operational capacity to bypass without equipment I do not have, and cannot acquire without breaking cover. The files I have been reading are the ones in the General Archive, the ones I was hired to catalogue, the ones that Meraven Strahl would have handled as a matter of routine. And what I have found in those files, over 5 months of reading with Meraven's competence and a trained pattern recognition, is that Sector Governor Urchmund Holt is not the man the officio briefing described. The briefing described a governor who was diverting Astra Militarum tithes. This is accurate. The tithe records show a systematic underpayment across the past 8 years, masked by a series of creative accounting techniques that reclassify military equipment requisitions as civilian infrastructure investments. The shortfall is significant. Multiple regiments in the subsector have reported equipment deficiencies that trace back to the Carthenwald tithe, and someone in the administratum, or possibly the Departamento Monitorum, noticed the pattern and passed the finding upward. That is where an ordinary file stops. A governor who steals gets an audit, then arbites, then a successor in that order, and none of those requires me. I am not told who decides these things. Operatives are given a name, a method, and a window, and the reasoning arrives already spent. What I was given was the second finding attached to the first because it changed my cover requirement. The governor had raised men, and the establishment on paper did not reconcile with what the district was paying for them. Anybody can read the constitution of a levy. It is published, and so is its strength, and the strength is accurate. What nobody outside his household could do was make 9,000 labourers agree with what was being spent on them, because the difference is not wages. A levy that costs what a line regiment costs is either being robbed by the man who raised it, which gets an auditor, or is not a levy, which gets me. The arbiters do not arrest a sector governor with an unquantified armed force behind him. They do that once, and the sector loses a manufactorum world to a civil war it started itself. Somebody above the line where my knowledge stops reached the same conclusion, and the file came to a temple, and the temple sent a catalogist. What the briefing did not describe, because the briefing did not know, is what the men were for. The trade compact records from the Oberquan subsector, the ones the governor accessed 47 times in 18 months, are not trade records. They are filed as trade records. They are stored in the trade records section of the archive. They bear the classification headers of trade documentation. But the documents inside the bindings are military requisitions, troop deployments, equipment manifests, salary disbursements for personnel attached to an organizational designation I have never encountered in any Imperial document. The Carthenwald Strategic Reserve. The name is not hidden. It is in the tithe assessments, in the district labour returns, in the capital's own gazette, constituted under the governor's father as a plateau security and labour levy for the manufactorum district. Half the civilized worlds in this sector have one. There is nothing in the constitution of it a clerk would look at twice. 9,000 men cannot be concealed. They eat, they are paid, they are billeted, their families draw allowances. What is concealed is what those men are equipped with, and what their medical division does. A labor levy carries neither. Both of those live in these bindings. Under a filing convention, only a catalogist with Merivyn Strahl's grasp of the system would read as irregular. The governor does not have a secret army. He has an ordinary one, doing something nobody has written down where it can be found. The Carthenwald Strategic Reserve. On 6 weeks of the access, Merivyn Strahl would have had anyway, and the curiosity appropriate to a catalogist who has found misfiled documents consists of 9,000 soldiers. They are equipped to a standard that exceeds the planetary defense force by a considerable margin. They are stationed in dispersed garrisons across the Growlhaven Plateau, the highland region north of the capital that contains the world's primary manufactorum hive, Hive Growlhaven, a facility that produces 38% of the sector's refined ceramite output, which means the Adeptus Mechanicus is in that hive, because refined ceramite is theirs, and nobody else is permitted to know how it is made. Their enclave occupies the upper production levels under a compact older than the Holt Charter, and inside it, the governor of Carthenwald is a foreign dignitary who may be received by appointment. He cannot enter it. He cannot survey its personnel. He cannot serve a labor draft on a single adept or menial inside its boundary, and Decival's genetic figures stop at the enclave wall because there was no lawful way to take a sample past it. The 11% is the hive. What the enclave is, nobody outside the enclave has ever been in a position to say, and it has not found the thing in the hive either. The intake schedules say why. The enclave takes no local intake. Its adepts arrive by ship from the forge that holds its compact, and its labor below the sanctified line is servitor. It has never looked at a Growlhaven gene line because it has never put one into a body it meant to keep. 500,000 people breed and die 400 meters beneath men who could identify the contamination in an afternoon and have no procedure that would ever bring them the sample. And a governor who reports Xeno's contamination in a hive that feeds a Mechanicus forge is not reporting it to the Imperium. He is reporting it to Mars, which answers to itself, decides on its own timetable, and has never in its history returned a facility it was obliged to purge. The Strategic Reserve is commanded by a man named Marshal Helvran Decivolt, whose service record I have not been able to locate in the archive, which means either it has been removed or it was never here, and both possibilities have implications I am not paid to evaluate. I am paid to kill the governor. The sanction was issued for the tithe diversion, and the sanction stands regardless of what the tithes were buying. A weapon does not audit the target, but the subsurface is not a weapon. The subsurface is the part of me that watches, and the subsurface has been watching the numbers in these files for 6 weeks, and the numbers do not add up in a way that I can ignore because the subsurface does not ignore patterns. That is what it is for. I put the manifest down and went and stood at the archive window for a while, which faces north across the compound wall towards the plateau. On a clear evening, you can see the haze over Growlhaven from there, a long smear of it sitting on the horizon where the stacks are. I had looked at it most days for 6 months without once thinking about what was underneath it. 9,000 soldiers is too many for personal protection. A governor who fears assassination does not raise an army. He raises a security detail. 9,000 soldiers is a force designed to fight something, and a force stationed on the Growlhaven Plateau is a force positioned around the Growlhaven hive, and a man who positions 9,000 soldiers around a manufactorum hive is a man who expects the hive to require 9,000 soldiers. I find the answer 3 weeks before the operational window opens. I find it because I am a catalogist, and catalogists cross-reference. And the Strategic Reserves equipment manifests include a procurement line that does not belong in a military formation's supply chain. Medical-grade genetic sequencing equipment. Cryogenic sample storage units rated for biological containment. Quarantine barriers in industrial quantities. These are not items a private army orders to fight a rebellion or guard a perimeter. These are items a private army orders when it is fighting something that lives inside people. The manifests led me to a secondary filing location in the sub-level climate vault, a section I had legitimate access to but no prior reason to visit, and inside that section I found Decivolt's operational reports, filed under a classification header I had never seen before, but which Meriven's training let me decode as a medical quarantine designation. The reports describe a biological survey conducted in the lower habitation levels of Hive Growlhaven across a 6-month period. The survey identified genetic deviation patterns in 11% of the hive's registered population that are consistent with, and I am quoting the report's language here because the language matters, extra-imperial biological contamination of a reproductive nature. What the reports recommend is where the governor's whole method sits, not isolation, not raids, nothing a hive notices. Flagged bloodlines are entered on off-world labor drafts and shipped out in ordinary quarterly batches. Sterility agents go into the water ration of the affected habitation levels, dosed low enough to read as a supply fault. Families with 3 or more flagged members are broken up by promotion. The father transferred to a plateau garrison, the sons apprenticed to a manufactorum 4 levels up. Every measure is a thing an administration does to its own people on any Tuesday, and the whole design of it is that the population under it never learns it is under anything at all. Decivolt's covering note says so in one line, and the line is the most frightened sentence in the file. Any measure that the affected population can identify as a measure will produce the response the measures exist to prevent. I know what that language means. The Temple briefs its operatives on it, and the Imperium's response to it is not 9,000 soldiers and a screening program. It is an inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, with Deathwatch behind him and the authority to declare a world compromised. 11% of a manufactorum hive leaves the world intact and the hive gone, along with everyone in it and a perimeter around it. The governor knows this. That is why he did not report it. Urchmund Hault is not a traitor. He is not embezzling tithes out of greed. He is diverting them to fund a private war against something growing inside the most productive facility in his sector. And he is fighting it alone because reporting it to the Imperium would trigger a response that would destroy the hive. And the hive produces 38% of the sector's ceramite. Without that ceramite, the sector's tithe grade drops 2 categories. A sector that drops 2 tithe grades receives the kind of attention that costs governors their positions at best and their lives at worst. And the Hault family has held this governorship for 370 years. He is trying to save his world. He is trying to save it quietly, the way a man who has spent his entire life in the administrative machinery of the Imperium believes problems should be solved, from the inside, with the resources at hand, without drawing attention. He is wrong. He is catastrophically wrong, because the kind of contamination described in Decivolt's reports does not get smaller when you fight it with soldiers. It gets smarter. It burrows deeper. It reads the response and adapts, because that is what it does. That is the entire function of its biology. And 9,000 men with las guns are not going to stop something that has spent however many years threading itself through 11% of a hive's genetic structure. But his wrongness is not incompetence. It is the particular wrongness of a man who understands the administrative consequences of the truth better than he understands the biological reality of the threat. And in the Imperium, the administrative consequences are usually worse. None of this changes my operation. The sanction stands. The governor dies. The method is the method. The timeline is the timeline. I return the reports to the climate vault. I walk to the archive. I sit at Meraven's desk, and I continue cataloguing trade records from the Oberkan subsector, and my hands do not shake, so I have 3 weeks and a job to do in them. Cataloguing. Filing. Delivering documents to an inner study where a man I am going to kill reads reports about a war he is going to lose. And every morning when the subsurface surfaces me from Meraven's sleep patterns, I remember what is in the climate vault. And every morning I put the knowledge away and walk the 7-minute corridor and do not deviate. The submersion wants me to forget. I will not let it. Not this time. I owe someone the weight of carrying it, even if I cannot say who. The operational window opens on the 219th day of my infiltration. It opens because 3 things converge simultaneously, and convergence is not coincidence. It is engineering. The first thing is that the governor's personal chirurgeon is off compound for a medical conference in the capital district, which means that the response time for a cardiac emergency in the governor's study stops being 4 minutes. And becomes however long it takes to bring a chirurgeon up from the capital district. The second thing is that Essendravol's security rotation has placed the least experienced operator on the servitor monitoring station for the afternoon shift. And I know this because I have mapped every rotation for 5 months, and the pattern is not random but keyed to seniority and rest day scheduling, peaks in its weakest staffing on the 3rd Cronus day of every 2nd month. The third thing is that I have a scheduled delivery to the governor's study at the 14th hour, 20 minutes after the governor's regular afternoon meal, which is when his blood pressure is at its diurnal peak, and a cardiac event will be most physiologically plausible. The document is the land survey report the governor requested through the Secretariat 2 days ago, pulled from the sub-level archive and clean when it left my hands. He does not know what he requested. There will be a dead governor and a succession crisis, and none of that is my concern. I walk to the study. I carry the crate. I walk at Meraven's pace, 58 centimeters per stride, data slate in my left hand, reading as I go. The corridors are quiet in the way that administrative compounds are quiet in the early afternoon, with the particular silence of large numbers of people doing small tasks in separate rooms, and the silence suits me. And I pass 3 people on the walk, and none of them looks at me, because nobody looks at Meraven Strawl. The governor is at his desk. He is reading. He glances up. He does not see me. I place the crate on the archive shelf, in the corner, in the 60-centimeter gap between the cabinet and the wall, and I kneel to sort the contents the way a catalogist kneels to sort contents. The servitor's head begins its sweep towards the door. My gloves come off. The vial is a thumbnail of glass under the 2nd knuckle of my left hand, and it opens with a pressure I have practiced until my fingers do it without instruction. The governor speaks, not to me. He is reading, and he says something short and irritated at the page in front of him, the way men alone in rooms do. and the sound arrives in the middle of the only second I have. Merivyn Strahl would look up. Merivyn Strahl has looked up at that man every time he has made a noise in this room for 2 years, and it is in her shoulders before it is anywhere else. I feel the whole borrowed body start to turn towards him, and I hold it where it is, and holding it costs me something I cannot spend twice. And my hand keeps moving, because the subsurface is driving the hand, and Merivyn is only driving the neck. I draw 2 fingertips across the cover page of the Land Survey report. Once, corner to corner. The gloves go back on. The servitor's head comes back around and finds a catalogist kneeling at a shelf with her hands full of paper. 1.6 seconds. I used all of them. He never looked up, and I could not have said in the moment which of us that was luck for. I carry the report to the document tray on the near side of his desk, where requested materials are placed for his review. I set it down. He will pick it up sometime in the next 2 hours. He will handle it the way he handles everything, with both hands, fingers spread across the cover, and 4 seconds of contact will be sufficient. He speaks. He does not look up from his reading. He asks whether the survey includes the plateau boundary assessments from the original Holt Charter, and I tell him that the boundary assessments are in a separate volume which I can retrieve by tomorrow. He makes the sound that means he has heard, and I leave the study, and I walk back to the archive, and I sit at Merivyn's desk and catalogue 3 more volumes of trade correspondence before the end of the working day, and then I walk to Merivyn's quarters and eat Merivyn's evening ration bar and lie on Merivyn's cot and close my eyes and do not sleep. The governor will be dead by morning. He does not know this. Nobody knows this except me, and by morning I will be gone. The extraction protocol for this operation is a dead drop in the commercial district, 3 kilometers from the compound. I will leave the compound at the 5th hour before the morning shift begins, through a service entrance that is secured by a biometric lock keyed to the cleaning staff's access cards. And I have one of those cards because I stole it from a cleaning woman's locker 9 weeks ago and replaced it with a duplicate that functions identically, and she has not noticed because the cards are visually identical and she does not pay attention to things that work. From the service entrance, I will walk to the dead drop, where a ground car will be waiting, driven by a contact I will never see again, who will take me to a landing field outside the capital, where a chartered shuttle will carry me to a system runner in low orbit. And from there, I will transit to the nearest temple facility, 13 days away by standard warp passage. Before I leave, I have one more task: the sanitization. The Officio's operational protocol requires that all evidence connecting the operative to the operation be destroyed or neutralized before extraction. This includes surveillance equipment, communication devices, and any materials generated during the operation that could compromise the Officio's involvement. In most operations, this means destroying a data slate and flushing a comm bead. In this operation, it means something else. It means the archive. Not the entire archive. The governor's records on the Carthenwald Strategic Reserve, the misfiled trade documents that conceal a private army's logistics, the deployment orders, the equipment manifests, the salary disbursements for 9,000 soldiers stationed around Hive Growlhaven. These are documents I discovered in the course of my infiltration. They are documents that describe activities connected to the governor's tithe diversion, the crime that generated the sanction, which means they are materials connected to the operation, which means they fall within the sanitization protocol. The Officio does not want evidence of the governor's activities to survive in a form that could lead an investigator back to the question of why the governor was diverting tithes, because that question leads to the answer that the governor had a reason, and reasons complicate the narrative, and the officio's preferred narrative is a governor who embezzled and died of natural causes. I pull the files at the 3rd hour. The archive is empty. Merivyn has after-hours access because Merivyn works late, and the security log will show her entering the archive at a time consistent with her established pattern, and the servitor in the archive corridor will record her carrying a document crate to the disposal furnace at the end of the sub-level corridor, which is where damaged and decommissioned documents are incinerated on a weekly schedule that Merivyn administers. She has done this twice a month for 2 years. The servitor will see nothing unusual, and neither will the operator watching it. The archivist principal will not notice, because the files were mislabeled and do not appear in his catalogue index, and a document that does not exist in the index cannot be missed. The organet stays where it is. The protocol says surveillance equipment. The protocol was written by people who have never tried to get a filament array out of a climate-controlled duct without marking the duct. It took an operative 4 months to thread it, and I have 1 night. So it stays, transmitting to a relay nobody is listening to, and Vol will find it in the 2nd week when she sweeps the room the dead man's documents came from. I have handed her the difference between what she can work out and what she can prove. I feed the files into the furnace 1 bundle at a time. I read them as I feed them. The protocol says destroy, not read. But the subsurface is very close to the surface now. 7 months of submersion have thinned the boundary to the point where Merivyn's catalogist instinct and my operative's pattern recognition are operating as a single function, and I cannot put a document into a furnace without reading it first. It is a compulsion born of 2 overlapping professional reflexes. And the result is that I stand in the sub-level corridor at 3 in the morning, reading the sum total of Governor Urchmond Holt's private war against the thing growing in his hive. And I understand the scale of what he was fighting, and I understand the scale of what I have just set loose. Decivolt's reports describe a progression. The initial genetic surveys, conducted 4 years ago under the pretext of a routine health census, identified deviation patterns in 3% of the hive's population. Follow-up surveys at 6-month intervals tracked the growth. 3%, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11. The curve is exponential, or close to it, and Decivolt's projections, which are the work of a competent military analyst rather than a genitor or a magos biologist, estimate that the contamination will reach 20% within 2 years and effective saturation within 5. Effective saturation, in Decivolt's terminology, means the point at which the contaminated population becomes the majority in the affected hive sectors and conventional military containment ceases to be feasible. And none of those figures are the current ones. I read the surveys as history, and they are not history. They are the start of a series that has not stopped. Sealed plateau traffic comes into this compound every fortnight, and has come in every fortnight I have been here, and I have logged each consignment into the vault under a header I decoded before I understood what I was decoding. I never opened one. By the time the manifest sent me down there, the newest was 3 days old and sitting on a shelf I had put it on myself. So the 11% is 4 years stale. I do not know what the number is now. The man who does know is a marshal on a plateau 200 kilometers north, and the man he reports it to will be dead before the morning shift, and the woman who has been filing the reports is me. Holt knew. He knew that his 9,000 were not enough and had never been enough, and that the time he was buying was measured in years rather than decades. His private correspondence with Decivolt, which I read in the last bundle before the furnace, includes a single document that is not a military report. It is a letter, handwritten, addressed to the Lord Commander of the Subsector Naval Station, requesting an audience to discuss a matter of sector security. Handwritten because the alternative was the Astropathic Choir, and the choir belongs to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, who serve the Imperium and not the governor, and who log what they send. It would have gone by ship in a man's coat, weeks in transit, which is how the Imperium has always carried the things it does not want written down. The letter is dated 8 months ago. It was never sent. The first paragraph is crossed out. Below it, a second attempt begins in the same hand, but shakier, and stops after one sentence. Below that, nothing. The rest of the page is blank. There is one more thing in those bindings, and it took me a further evening to see it, because it is not in the operational reports. It is in the personnel returns. A plateau security and labor levy raises its men from the plateau. That is what the word levy means, and it is why the constitution of it never looked irregular to anybody. 9,000 soldiers drawn, since the governor's father constituted the levy, from the habitation levels of the district they garrison, from Hive Growlhaven, from the same registered population in which Decivol's surveys were finding deviation at 3%, then 5, then 9. Nobody screened the reserve. The screening program was something the reserve did to other people, and there is no line anywhere in 4 years of returns where the instrument was turned around and pointed at the hand holding it. So the drafts get compiled by clerks from the levels. The drafts are meant to empty. The water dosing is scheduled by a medical division recruited out of the sectors it is dosing. The flagged families are broken up by promotion boards, sitting men who came off the same stair. I cannot prove from a personnel return that a single one of them was contaminated. What I can see is that the arithmetic does not need a conspiracy. It only needs the ordinary rate, applied to 9,000 men drawn from that population, across 2 governors, and then handed the entire apparatus of its own containment. He knew. He had been fighting for 4 years by a method quiet enough that the thing he was fighting had never once been given a reason to show itself. And that was the whole of his achievement, and the whole of his defeat, because a measure small enough to go unnoticed is a measure small enough to be outbred. He knew it was not enough. And he had drafted the letter that would have brought the Inquisition and the Death Watch and everything that followed, and he had not sent it because sending it was the end of his world's hive and his family's governorship and 370 years of halt administration, and he chose to keep fighting instead, because the alternative was admitting that the problem was bigger than he was. And governors do not admit that. Not in the Imperium. Not when the admission costs everything. What I am burning is a set, not a subject. Decivol wrote every one of these off a desk on the plateau, and marshals keep their own file, 200 kilometers north behind 9,000 men. And there is the cabinet, 2 meters from where I applied the compound this afternoon, holding a man's private correspondence behind a seal keyed to his biometrics. A gene code is beyond me. It is also not a lock, it is a delay. Somebody will bring his hand to it inside the week. So the protocol is satisfied and the archive is clean and a clerk will trip over nothing. That is a narrower thing than the word suggests. I have never confused the protocol being satisfied with the thing being finished. I hold the letter over the furnace. My hand does not move for 5 seconds, which is 4.5 seconds longer than any part of this operation has required me to hesitate. Then I let go. The edges curl and the ink darkens, and the governor's handwriting disappears into ash. And with it goes the only written record of a man who saw something growing under his feet and tried to stop it with the tools he had. Marshal Decivol will still be alive in the morning, and that is the part nobody upstairs has costed. His commission came from the governor's hand and dies with the governor's heart, and a marshal of a levy has no standing to address the administratum or the navy. If he reports 4 years of unauthorized operations and unauthorized medicine on a tithe-paying population and xenos contamination concealed from the Inquisition in his own hand, signed. He is the one man who both knows and cannot speak, and every day of silence lengthens what he would be confessing to. A levy is funded out of the governor's district accounts, and those accounts freeze the day he dies. Urchmond Holt has no children. No wife in the household returns for as far back as the household keeps them. A cousin's line on Cassenholm nobody has written to in 2 generations, and an administratum with a whole body of procedure for a hereditary seat that runs out of heirs and no reason to hurry because an unconfirmed governorship is a sector's revenue administered directly and answerable to nobody local. Confirmation is a matter of years. He was the 14th of 14, and there is no 15th. A governor with a son has somewhere to hand a problem this size. Holt had nowhere to hand it, so the choice was to report it and end his world's hive inside his own lifetime, or fight it, and possibly not. Meanwhile, 9,000 armed men stop being paid. They do not go home. Some of them are home. The garrisons sit on the plateau their families live under. What happens to a levy that stops being paid and does not disperse has a heading in the administratum's handbooks, and the heading is not disbandment. And whoever is confirmed in that seat inherits 9,000 men he did not raise, holding the ground around the facility that pays his tithe. He will keep them. He will put his own officers over them. He will never be given a reason to screen the ranks, because screening a levy for anything is a measure, and I have read what Decivol wrote about measures. I do not report this. Exceeding operational scope triggers additional reconditioning, and each time they go in, they take more than they intend to, and there is not a great deal left to take. I leave the compound at the 5th hour. The cleaning woman's access card opens the service entrance, and her name goes into the door log at the 5th hour on the morning the governor dies, which is a thing I did 9 weeks ago and have not thought about since. Essendra Vol will work it out. She will spend the first day on the chirurgeon's finding and the second on the compound roster. And somewhere in the second day she will put a dead governor beside a catalogist who did not come to work. She is better than her position, and I have never pretended otherwise. She will be right, and she will write it down, and the written thing will go up to the administratum office that requested the audit that started all of this. A security chief reporting that her governor was removed by the Officio Assassinorum is reporting that she failed to prevent an act of the Imperium. There is no procedure for the second half of that sentence. Somebody will thank her for her diligence and offer her the same grade on another world. I have seen this shape before from further away. It is not that they will disbelieve her. It is that being correct is not a thing the machinery has a use for. Her name is Dovrik. She works the residential blocks and does not check a card that opens the doors it is supposed to open. Vol will pull the door logs before she pulls anything else, and there will be one credential used at an hour when nobody had business at that entrance, and it will not be mine. I do not know what happens to Dovrik. That is the honest answer, and it is also the one that costs me nothing to give. The card was not chosen because she was expendable. Her locker is on the corridor with the weakest observation, and her shift pattern put her off-site the night I needed it. Nobody in the Officio wrote her name down. Nobody weighed her against anything. She is not a sacrifice, which would at least be a decision. She is a door. The ground car is at the dead drop. The driver does not speak. The shuttle is on schedule. I board it carrying nothing except the sin skin under my clothes, the polymorphine injector under my skin, the phase sword in a sheath that reads as a spinal brace on medical scanners, and the knowledge of what is growing in Hive Growlhaven, which is not a physical object and cannot be confiscated, and will go with me to the temple, whether I want it to or not. The warp transit takes 9 days, 4 fewer than the standard estimate for this route. I spend them in a munitorum berth the size of Merrivan's quarters, a cot, a shared ablutions block, and a porthole with the shutters sealed, because nobody looks outside during warp transit, and nobody should. I eat from the transit galley. I sleep in the pattern Merrivan sleeps in, on my left side with one arm under the pillow, because 219 days in her body have made that the default and the reconditioning at the temple will reset it, or it will not. And I have stopped being able to predict which habits the reconditioning will take and which ones it will leave. On the 4th day of transit, I catch myself arranging the contents of my kit bag in the order Merrivan arranges her archive shelf, by subject, then by date, then by size. I stop. I rearrange it randomly. An hour later, I find I have rearranged it back without noticing. The subsurface should have suppressed this. The fact that it has not means the submersion went deeper than intended, and someone at the facility will need to address it. The temple facility sits on a world the officio has never named to me, operated by people whose identities I am not cleared to learn. Callidus operatives rotate through secondary stations scattered across the Imperium. This one is Row Tesseract, and I have been here 7 times before, or possibly 8, and the uncertainty is the reconditioning's doing rather than mine. It occupies a subterranean complex beneath a disused mining installation. The shuttle lands on a pad that retracts into the ground. The cargo elevator descends for 4 minutes. I prefer my reconditioning at the scheduled intervals, so I do not calculate how deep that puts me. The first thing that happens when I step off the elevator is a medical screening conducted by 2 temple chirurgeons who are masked and gloved, and who do not speak to me except to give instructions, and the instructions are limited to positional commands. Stand, turn, raise your arms, open your mouth, look left, look right. I have killed men who were better company. They take blood. They take tissue samples. They run a neural scan that involves a device pressed against the base of my skull that hums at a frequency I can feel in my teeth. They measure my bone density, my muscle mass distribution, my dermal elasticity, my facial bone structure. They are checking the polymorphine's work. They are checking whether my body has returned to its baseline configuration, or whether the transformation into Merrivan Stroll has left structural residue, a known effect of extended polymorphine use that the temple monitors with the same clinical detachment it applies to everything else. The results take 2 hours. I wait in a holding cell. The temple calls it that. It is a room with a cot, no other furniture, and a door that locks from the outside. I have spent cumulative months of my life in rooms like this. They are not uncomfortable. They are not designed to be uncomfortable. They are designed to be empty, because empty is what the temple wants an operative's environment to be between operations. A space with no stimuli, no patterns, no details to engage the pattern recognition instinct that the submersion has spent months activating. The emptiness is part of the reconditioning. It begins the process of stripping the cover identity by removing the context that sustains it. Merrivan Strahl existed in a world of archive shelves and index cards and climate-controlled corridors and a pressed flower in a glass frame on a shelf nobody visited. In this room, There are none of those things, and the part of me that is still Merivyn begins to thin, like ink in water. I catch myself looking at the bare shelf above the cot and wondering where the flower went. The emptiness works both ways, which the temple has either not considered or has considered and filed as acceptable. A room with nothing in it to look at is a room in which the only thing left to do is go through it in order, from the eyelid forward, and the screening results are not back yet. The reconditioning itself takes 3 days. This is what the life consists of when it is not consisting of polymorphine and killing. And it is the part nobody outside the temple has ever been told about. So I am going to be exact. Day 1 is the chemical phase. They put something into my arm that has a designation rather than a name, because the temple does not name things it considers proprietary. It targets the pathways the submersion built and dissolves them. Not metaphorically. It breaks bonds in the brain and disrupts the protein structures that hold the cover identity's behavior. It is targeted, it is effective, and it hurts. The pain is different from polymorphine. Polymorphine is physical. This is cognitive. It feels like forgetting, if forgetting had a texture, and the texture was coarse and hot and located behind the eyes. Polymorphine is worse, but polymorphine does not make you forget which hand you write with. I lose Merivyn in stages. The habits go first. The stylus grip, the forward-leaning walk, the flat palms on a binding. Then the knowledge, the filing conventions, the catalogue index, the names of colleagues, the layout of the archive. The sensory associations go last, and mostly do not go at all. The smell of old paper, the climate control system at night, the quality of light in the sub-level corridor at 3 in the morning, the texture of a ration bar eaten standing at a desk. They are encoded too diffusely to strip without taking working parts of me with them. So the temple leaves them and relies on the next operation to write over them. This is the mechanism by which I have become what I am. Day 2 is the surgical phase. The chirurgeons remove the polymorphine injector, inspect the subdermal implants, replace the components that have degraded during the operation, and install a fresh injector loaded with a new dosage calibrated to my current body mass and bone density. They also perform a neural implant diagnostic, which involves opening a small panel at the base of my skull, and I use the word panel with full awareness of what it implies about the degree to which my body has been modified from its original configuration, and connecting the implant's data dam to an external cogitator that reads the operational log. The data dam is the device that separates the operative's true identity from the cover identity during submersion. It records the boundary state throughout the operation, and the chirurgeons use the log to assess submersion depth, duration, and any irregularities. My log shows an irregularity. The chirurgeon does not tell me what it is. She makes a notation on her data slate and moves on to the implant maintenance, and I do not ask because asking questions during surgical reconditioning is not encouraged, and the last operative I am aware of who asked questions during reconditioning was given answers, and the answers involved additional procedures that extended the reconditioning by a week. Day 3 is the assessment. This is the day I meet my handler. I say handler. The temple's term is overseer. Her name, or the name she uses with me, is Tefane. She is a thin woman with grey hair cut shorter than mine and eyes that do not move when she speaks, which gives her the appearance of someone who is looking at a 0.3 centimeters behind your head. And the effect is deliberate, because Tefane was a Callidus operative before she was an overseer, and everything about her appearance is a choice, and the choice she has made is to look like someone who does not see you as a person. This is professional practice, not unkindness. An overseer who regards her operatives as people is an overseer whose assessments are compromised by attachment, and the temple tolerates neither compromised assessments nor compromised operatives. Tolerance being a luxury the Imperium's most expensive weapons program cannot afford. Tefane sits across from me at a bare metal table in a room with no windows and no decoration, and no feature except a recessed lumen in the ceiling that casts a flat white light, and she asks me questions. The questions are operational. Describe the insertion. Describe the cover establishment. Describe the target's security. Describe the kill method. Describe the sanitization. Describe the extraction. I answer each question in the order it is asked, in the language the temple trained into me, stripped of anything that could be read as opinion or judgment. The officio does not want to know what I think about the operation. It wants to know what happened. I do not mention the Genestealer contamination. I do not mention the strategic reserve. I do not mention the governor's unsent letter or the blank page where he gave up trying to ask for help. The debrief covers the operation as sanctioned: infiltration, cover maintenance, target elimination, sanitization, extraction. Everything within those parameters I report in full. Everything outside those parameters I do not report, because reporting it would be an admission that I operated outside my scope, and operating outside scope triggers a conditioning review. And I have been through enough reconditioning to know that each one takes a little more and returns a little less. The debrief is not the only record. The data dam wrote its own log for 219 days and does not consult me about the contents. And somewhere, a Venus analyst holds a sanitization manifest showing a document burn with no requisition attached. Neither accuses me of anything. They sit in different buildings under different authorities, and that is the whole of my protection. Not that there is nothing to find, but that finding it would require somebody to want to. I have never known that to happen. I have also never been able to establish that it does not. One question is not operational: whether I experienced any subjective anomalies during the submersion. I tell her the cover identity persisted past extraction, that I continued to exhibit the target personality's behavioral patterns during transit, and that motor habits associated with the cover have not fully resolved despite the chemical purge. She makes a notation. She does not look up. Residual patterning within expected parameters for an operation of this duration. Chirurgical assessment noted to be factored into my conditioning calibration for the next deployment. All of it in the tone of a woman reading from a manual she wrote herself and no longer needs to consult. Her left hand, resting flat on the table, presses its thumbnail into the pad of her index finger. Merrivan's gesture, or someone else's. It does not matter. Tefane was a Callidus before she was an overseer, and whatever sediment she carries it behind that flat stare where nobody is invited to look. Residual patterning is not the lingering habit of a woman who held documents with flat palms. Something remains from every operation, and the sum of those remainders is not a personality. It is a texture. When the reconditioning strips the latest layer, it does not expose my original self beneath it. It exposes the previous layer, and beneath that another, going down through decades of faces, and at the bottom there is supposed to be me. I have reached for her in the gaps, and the bottom is not there. The earliest thing I can access is the training chamber. 12 girls, Lorraine changing shape. Everything before that is a scaffold the temple built, and a scaffold is not a memory. Its function is not truth. Its function is stability, and I have been stable for 53 years. I am a woman made of other women. The way I hold a cup is from a clerk on Venice Court 9 years ago. The reconditioning took the clerk and left the hands. The way I stand when I am waiting is from a dock supervisor on a world the stripping took the name of. And the melody is not Merrivan's. Merrivan hummed it because I hummed it first, during the submersion, and the cover identity took it for its own. It comes from an operation far enough back that I do not know which woman it belonged to. I carry it the way a river carries sediment, not by choice, but by the physics of flow. Tefane gives me the new briefing dossier on the 4th day. It is a slim plastic folder containing a target profile, an operational brief, and a preliminary cover assessment. I open the folder. I read the profile. The target is a renegade senior officer in the Astra Militarum who has seized control of a fortress world in the Juniver Reach and is refusing to acknowledge the authority of the subsector command. The operational brief classifies it as a decapitation sanction with extreme difficulty because the target is a military professional in a fortified position surrounded by soldiers who are personally loyal, and the method prescribed is infiltration through the fortress's support staff. The cover assessment identifies the skin. A man named Zarek Omen, a quartermaster's aide recently transferred from the supply depot at the fortress's secondary gate. He is 31 years old, heavy-set, with a limp from a shrapnel wound that healed poorly. He has been selected because he has compound access, because his transfer is recent enough that the fortress staff do not know him well, and because he is unremarkable. I read the brief twice. The temple grades these, and this one is at the top of the scale, and it has been given to an operative whose data dam came back with an irregularity nobody would name. I am not being punished. Punishment would require somebody to have formed a view. I am being allocated by assessed remaining value. The same way the Munitorum decides where to send a regiment that has already been through something. If it works, the Imperium gets a decapitation it could not otherwise buy. If it does not, the thing that failed was already written down as degrading. The polymorphine will need to build mass rather than reduce it. The limp will need to be practiced until it is reflexive. The voice will require a register shift that puts additional strain on the restructured vocal architecture. It will take longer. It will hurt more. It will be a body that fits me the way a uniform fits a child pretending to be a soldier, which is badly and with visible effort. And the effort is what makes the transformation worth doing, because a body that does not fit properly is a body that requires constant conscious maintenance, and constant conscious maintenance keeps the submersion shallow, and shallow submersion means I will stay closer to myself for longer. I close the folder. I sit in the holding cell with the dossier beside me, and the silence of a facility 300 meters underground around me. I do not think about the governor. I do not think about Hive Graalhaven. I do not think about what is standing on the Graalhaven plateau under arms, drawn from the levels the surveys were reading, holding the ground around a forge nobody is permitted to enter, waiting for a successor to confirm its officers. I do not think about the only man still looking, having no authority to look and no survivable way to say what he sees. The findable version is ash, and I am the one who put it in the furnace. And I did that correctly, according to the protocol. On the same night, I did everything else correctly. The rest of it is sitting where I left it, north of the capital and behind a lock, waiting for somebody with the standing to look and a reason to want to. I think about Zarek Uman instead. I think about his limp and what kind of boots he wears in the fortress, and whether his hands are calloused from the supply work. I think about becoming him. I think about the polymorphine and the pain and the months of submersion that will follow, during which I will sink below my own surface, and Zarek Uman will rise to fill the space, and the woman I am now, whoever that is, will fold into the subsurface and wait. She has a melody she cannot place, and a pair of hands that hold cups with both palms wrapped around them, because a clerk on Venice Court held her cup that way 9 years ago, and the reconditioning took the clerk but left the grip. She is a pause between people. She is the interval between Merivan Strahl and Zarek Uman, the gap in the sequence where the operative surfaces long enough to be serviced and reloaded and aimed at the next target. The temple made her out of other women, and she has been good. The Imperium has always been willing to spend lives. The temple found a way to spend the same one repeatedly. I pick up the dossier. I open it to the first page. I begin to study the face that is going to be mine. In 5 weeks, a quartermaster's aide will walk through a fortress gate, humming a melody he does not recognize because it does not belong to him. It belongs to nobody. It belongs to every person I have ever been, carried forward through 53 years of killing and becoming and unbecoming. And one day, the reconditioning will take it, or the polymorphine will stop working, or the temple will decide the weapon has worn out, and on that day the melody will stop, and nobody alive will know what it was or where it came from, because the people who carried it are dead, or dissolved or buried in the sediment of a body that has been rebuilt so many times it has forgotten its own foundation. That is the whole of it, in order, out loud, to nobody. It took most of a night, and I have said it through once, which is all the method allows, and the parts that hold will hold, and the rest is already going. Sometime after the next one, there will be another cell, and another recitation, and a different woman's habits in my hands, and I will say that one through too, and somewhere underneath both of them, there will be a little less of whoever is doing the saying. I read the file. I study the face. I begin.